Hey everyone, we're going to take a look at using providers in a NativeScript Angular 2 application. So first of all, a provider is something that you can use globally throughout your application. It's something that you can inject in each one of your pages and then use. So some of the scenarios that you can do is you can maybe take all of your database code that you would typically put inside of your components and pull it into its own provider to be used globally in the application. Maybe you want to pass complex data between each of the pages of your application. Or maybe you just want to use some global variables and methods rather than adding them to each one of your pages. So there's a lot of different scenarios on where this is useful. This particular example that we're going to be looking at is going to be working with SQLite databases. If you've been following along, I did make 2 Angular 2 tutorials on SQLite and NativeScript, one of being using SQLite, the other being using a pre-populated SQLite database. This tutorial is going to be more around the first one, where we're actually just going to take SQLite code for using SQLite in a NativeScript application and moving it into its own provider that we can use in every page of the application without duplicating a lot of code. With that said, let's go ahead and create a new project on our desktop. Let's go ahead and say tns create, let's call it provider project, and we're going to use --ng for Angular. All right, with the project created, let's go ahead and navigate into it. And we're going to add some build platforms. So we're going to say tns platform add iOS and tns platform add Android. So you saw that I did add both of these platforms. If you're not using a Mac with Xcode installed, building for iOS will not work. But this tutorial, you can use the same code set to build for both, but you just need a Mac in order to build for iOS. So with these 2 providers added, the next thing we want to do is we want to install the SQLite NativeScript plugin. So we can do that by saying tns plugin add NativeScript SQLite. Now, just to reiterate something that I said in the previous tutorials that I had made, so the SQLite plugin for NativeScript has a free and a paid edition. The free edition does not have TypeScript type definitions. It does have all of the same features except for the TypeScript definitions. So what this means is it'll be a little more complicated when it comes to using it in a TypeScript application like an Angular 2 application, but we won't be missing out on anything important. It'll just deter us a little bit, which isn't a big deal. You'll see that. So with the plugin installed, we do need to create some service files. So we're going to have one service in this application, or provider, I'm sorry. Sometimes they're referred to as services. They're actually, Angular refers to them as providers. You can even call them singletons if you want. So what we're going to do is we're going to create that provider class, or files and directories. So we can say make directory, and I'm doing P so that way it recursively creates all of these directories in the line. But we're going to say app, providers, database. And then inside of that database directory, we're going to create a file. So we're going to say app, providers, database, database.ts. And if you don't have the make directory and touch commands, go ahead and create them manually. It doesn't do anything special. It's just a cool feature of Mac and Linux. I'm not sure if Windows has that. It might. But again, I'm not a Windows user. All right, so with those files created, our plugin added, and all of our platforms set up, let's go ahead and open that project in an editor. I'm going to be using Atom by GitHub, but you can really use whatever you want. So before we actually start working on the pages of the application, we are going to make that provider. So go into App, Providers, Database, database.ts. And we first need to import a few dependencies that we're going to be using in this provider. So first of all, we can say import injectable, and we're importing that from Angular/core. So this injectable class that we're importing allows us to inject it into our ng module, as well as each of the pages that we plan to use it. So inside of the constructor methods. The next thing we want to do is we want to say var SQLite equals require NativeScript SQLite. And you'll notice that this import is a little different than the previous. Again, this is because there are no TypeScript definitions for the free version of this plugin. So we just imported it a different way. Not too big of a deal. It does make things not so cosmetically pleasing, but it'll work. And then again, we'll be missing the autocomplete that our editors offer as well without the TypeScript definitions. All right, so we imported the only two requirements. The next thing we want to say is injectable and create our database class. So we're going to say export class database. And we're going to have three methods in here. We're going to have a constructor. We're going to have a method called insert. And we're going to have a method called fetch. All right. So before we start populating each one of these methods, of course, we're going to start with the constructor method. But let's go ahead and define what variables are going to be used throughout this particular provider. And these variables will be accessible through each page that we inject it on. So we're going to say private DB. It's going to be of type any. We're going to say private is instantiated. And that's going to be of type Boolean. And you'll see where we're going with this right now. So every time you inject this provider into a constructor method, it will try to use a new instance of it. So it won't try to use a new instance. It'll just refire this constructor method. And our goal here with this database is we only want one instance to be open for our entire application. We don't want it to keep opening instances of our SQLite database. So what we're going to do is we're going to make use of that is an instantiated method, or Boolean. So we can say if is instantiated. So if is not instantiated, and we actually need to put a this behind it. So if this is not set or it's false, then go ahead and enter this block. And inside of this block, this is where we're going to not only open our database, but create our table if it does not exist already. So we're going to say new SQLite. Let's go ahead and open a database called MyDB. It'll create it if it does not exist. And then we're going to say then. We're going to say DB. And this is our success callback, or the success point of our promise. All right. So with the database open, potentially, what we want to do is we want to say db.exec_SQL. And we're going to enter a query in here. So we're going to say create table if not exist. And we're going to call that table people. And that table is going to have an ID, which is going to be an integer. It's going to be a primary key, and it's going to auto increment. We're also going to have a first name, which is text. And we're going to have a last name, which is also text. So again, this is very, very familiar to what we already saw in a previous tutorial. We're just pulling it into a provider class. We're gonna say then. We're gonna say ID, even though we're really not going to use the ID. But if we wanted to, we'd get an ID, or we can say result. In this case, result of this query. And then we can figure out what we want to do because it was successful. And in this case, because it was successful, what we want to say is we want to say this.db equals db. So this.db is our open database instance. We also want to say this.isInstantiated equals true, because we do not want to call this again. Our database is open, it is stored, it is usable in each one of our pages now. Now each one of these promises has an error result as well. We're not going to go ahead and fill that in. You could do that if you want on your own, but we're just going to worry about the successes. So with our constructor created, now we can focus on these two methods that we can access in each one of the pages. So let's start with the insert. So typically when you insert, you're probably going to pass in data to be saved. Let's go ahead and call that data any. So the idea here is we're going to pass in an object, but since I don't want to create an interface for this object, I'm just going to call it any. I'm taking the lazy way out. So we're going to say return. We're going to say this.db, we're going to say dot execute SQL, and we're going to enter our query now. So we're going to say insert into people. We're going to insert a first name and a last name. Remember, the ID is auto incrementing and it's a primary key. We say values, and this is a parameterized query. So we have two parameters that we will be passing with data. So we have that. So you'll do comma, and let's say data.firstname, data.lastname. So whatever was passed, and we can just close it off with a semicolon because what we're doing is we're returning. Actually, let's define what we're returning here. Let's say we're returning a promise, which is any type of promise. So the page that calls this function will then be able to worry about the success or the error, and we're going to see that in just a few minutes. So now let's worry about the fetch. The fetch is going to be a little different. We're going to put a little more work into it. Because we can't, I mean, in theory, we can just return the promise. But if we do that, we'll have to do all kinds of data parsing wherever it was called from. And we don't want to do data parsing. We want to let this service take care of it. So we're going to create our own promise now. So we're going to say return new promise, resolve, reject. And in this case, now we need to figure out what's going to make it successful or not successful. So we can say this.db.all. So we're doing a select query. So select all properties from all records of people. We're going to say then rows. And now we need to parse out those rows into an array of objects because this is a JavaScript application. Rows of weird data is not anything particularly useful to us. That's why objects are much more useful. So what we can do is we can say let people equals empty array, and we can say let row in rows. So we're going to loop through that result set, the rows, and we're going to say people dot push, and we're going to push an object into this array. So we're going to say ID, which is going to be rows, row, and then 0. And then likewise with the other two, I'm just going to copy those. We're going to say first name. This is going to be 1. So these are columns. And then we're going to say last name, and this is 2. And we don't need a comma at the end of that one. So we have our array of data now, and what we want to do is we want to return it. So we're going to say resolve people. Otherwise, if there was some kind of error, let's go ahead and create an error in this case. If there was some kind of error, we can say reject error. So if there was some kind of error inside of this select statement, return an error. Otherwise, return an array of objects, so something clean. So that's our provider. Our provider is nothing complicated, but you'll see now that when we use it in our component, it's actually quite nice. So if we go into our component file now, well, before we do that, we actually want to import this globally in our application. So we need to go to main.ts. So it's an app and then main.ts. And we want to say import database from, and we're going to say what is it? Providers, database, database. So whatever our path was. Inside of our ng module, what we would do is we would say providers, and this is an array. So we only have one provider, so we're going to import database. Now it can be injected in each one of our pages, or in each one of our components. So open up app.component.ts. Let's wipe out what's inside of this class here because we don't need it. We do want to import our provider again, so we're going to say import. We're going to say database from, and this will be provider, database, database. So you'll see that we imported it twice, but we have to. Just because we imported it into ng module doesn't mean that we can import it into, that it's already imported in our components, and vice versa. So this is actually plural providers. Save it. All right. Now let's create our class here. So let's go ahead and say public people. This is going to be an array of any. This is going to be what we display on the screen. That's why it's public. We're going to say public constructor. We're going to say private database. So this is where we're injecting it. And we're going to say this.people equals empty array. All right. So let's go ahead and create our methods. So these are the methods that will interact with the provider. And while I'm going to name them the same thing, they don't need to be named the same thing. It's just whatever you want to name it. So let's say public insert, and let's say public fetch. And we're actually going to start with the fetch. So what we can do here is we can say this.database dot fetch dot then result, which should be an array of object. We're going to say this.people equals result, and hit save. So you'll notice that it's underlining for us. That's because if I go to database.ts, I didn't define the return, so it's going to be promise any, and it should go away inside of our app component.ts now. When working with promises, you should probably define the response type. Otherwise, your editor may complain at you. So we do have our fetch method now. It's very easy. Wasn't a whole lot to it. Imagine if we had to do all of this fetch code in every single page. Nobody wants that, and that's one of the conveniences of using a provider here. So we can just do this every time. Now for the insert, let's say this.database.insert. Since this application is going to be very simple, we're going to just statically define our data here. We're going to use constant data. We're going to say first name. Let's use Nick. And we're going to say last name. Let's use Raboy. Because remember, we pass in an object and it'll get pulled out. We're going to say then the result. And then when we get our result, it'll return an ID. We don't really care about the ID. Instead, we're going to say this.fetch. We want to insert and then repopulate our list of people. So we're not quite done yet. We could be done, but there's one more thing I like to add here. So we're not initializing this database. We're not loading the data when the page loads, and you shouldn't do that inside of the constructor. It's frowned upon to load data in the constructor method. You could initialize data, but never load it inside of the constructor. So what we can do is we can say on init. We're going to import that. We're going to say implements on init, and then we have this function called public ng on init. So this is where we can do our loading of data. It'll get triggered after the constructor. And there's something strange about the way we're doing it here. So as you remember, our database provider, it's asynchronous. It works with promises inside of that constructor. So we don't truly know when that data is loaded or when the database is opened and the table is created. So instead, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to add a timer. So that way it'll give it a few seconds to load before it tries to load our data. If you're working with providers that are not asynchronous in the constructor, you don't have to worry about this. But this is just a little cheat. And there's better ways to do this, but for simplicity, I'm going to do it this way. So I'm going to say set timeout, and I'm going to say this.fetch, and I'm going to say let's go ahead and give it a half of a second. Should be quick enough to load our database. So we don't have a UI yet, so let's go ahead and get that in real quick. It'll be very fast. There's not a whole lot to our UI. So if we go to app.component.html, let's go ahead and clear this out. We can leave the stack layout. Inside of the stack layout, let's go ahead and create a list view. So we're going to say list view. We're going to say items equals people. So this is our public variable. Inside of the list view, we have to define our template. And we're going to say let person equals item. So now every item of people is going to be called person. We're going to close that off. And now let's create a label in here. So we're going to say label. We're going to say text equals, let's say person.firstname, and then we're going to say person.lastname. And then close our label. We're going to make it a little more fancy than this. We're going to add an action bar up top. We're going to say action bar. We're going to say title equals SQL provider. And we're going to add 2 buttons. So we're going to say action item. We're going to say text equals, let's say add. Let's say iOS.position. So we're going to position it in the navigation bar for iOS. And we're going to say that's going to be positioned on the right. It's going to have a tap event. So when we tap it, it's going to call the insert function inside of our app-component.ts file. And then we're going to close it off. And to save us some typing, I'm going to clone this row. And instead of add, we're going to create a refresh. Although we don't necessarily need it, but I'm going to have it in there anyways. And it'll call fetch just in case. Perfect. So at this point, we should be able to run this application now without any problems. So going back into our terminal, I'm going to run it on iOS. You can run it however you want. I'm going to say TNS emulate iOS. All right, so the app did load without any problems. There's no data in it, of course. So if I click add, it added my name to the list. And you'll see that it looks like it created an extra row. It didn't really create an extra row. This is just how iOS does things. It's a little weird, in my opinion. But I can keep adding these rows if I want. I don't need to hit refresh because it's already fetching. But let's go ahead and close out of this application completely, and we'll see if our kind of ng on init worked. I'll close out of all of this. I have a lot of stuff running. So I'll open provider project. And it did load it. So that's exactly what we wanted. So just to reiterate here on what we did. So the point of this application wasn't to really create a app component or app component.html file. It was more to create this provider and to show you that we can take all of this database code. And it really doesn't have to be database code. It could be whatever you want in a provider. But we took all of this code, and now we can actually inject it into each one of our pages. And it significantly reduces the amount of duplicate code we have. It makes things a lot easier, a lot cleaner. And it's definitely a preference when it comes to using certain features of Angular 2. So this is more of an Angular 2 thing than anything, although the SQLite plugin is a NativeScript plugin, and this is for a NativeScript native application.